Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines, where we shall be discussing the brave and courageous decision made by Donald Trump to issue an executive order that condemns and puts sanctions on the International Criminal Court in The Hague for pursuing international arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for alleged war crimes in Gaza. And we'll also be discussing the impact this will have on the International Criminal Court in The Hague and exposing its weaponization of international law against Israel.
And as part of this, the wrath of President Trump and just seeing the fallout that is going to be occurring as a result of his statements and sanctions made against the ICC. We have statements being made by world leaders in favor and support, reaffirming the nation's support for the International Criminal Court, while others are seemingly siding with Trump or remaining silent on the issue. Such an important conversation we're having this evening.
But I mean, this is also, it's not only about Israel and protecting the close relationship that Donald Trump has with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, because we know that last week the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spent a week in Washington, D.C. Not only did he spend time with Donald Trump, the newly elected president, but he spent time with his vice president, as well as the Secretary of State, as well as the Defense Secretary and other congressional leaders as well. So to get the full backing of the US administration behind him and Israel. But it's also a battle, I think, against the kind of nationalism that Trump wants to pursue against these global institutions that are a law unto themselves, that are morally corrupt and bankrupt, pretty much like the International Criminal Court in The Hague, when last November the prosecuting chief Karim Khan himself issued an international arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant.
And of course, the charges that are being made are in relation to alleged war crimes in Gaza. And the crimes that have been outlined, frankly, are ignoring exactly the context in which this war is finding itself in. It ignores the origin of this war and the conflict. It ignores the massive amount of aid that Israel continues to supply. It ignores the realities of the supply of energy as well and water. Yes, there have been moments in the war where water supply and energy has been momentarily cut so that there could be advanced operations ensued against Hamas, but everything was done and everything has been done in line with the rules of war, so to speak.
Absolutely. And also the other component in this one, isn't it, Reagan, is that Israel's facing an asymmetrical warfare.
Yes.
Israel's not facing a conventional war. Hamas use women and children and old people as human shields in which they fire and hide their rockets. We know that their headquarters, they like to base the headquarters in hospitals,
yes,
in schools. So the whole way they're playing is using the population in Gaza as kind of human shields.
Underneath UNRWA facilities as well. I mean, the whole of Gaza is being used by Hamas to accomplish its evil end. And of course, in the Hamas charter, right at the beginning, it speaks of how Israel as a state will continue to exist until Islam obliterates it. So it doesn't even speak of itself as being the catalyst to that obliteration. It is a fundamental Islamist ideology that it has its hope in, and that's why we see this wholesale willingness even to surrender the entirety of Gaza's population to rampant destruction, if that's what it takes to actually see Israel obliterated. But of course, Israel hasn't been obliterated. It won't be obliterated. It can't be obliterated. The God of Israel is continually defending and continually acting in accordance with his perfect plan and purpose. And yet this has not stopped Hamas from conducting much of this conflict in an egregiously depraved way, targeting specifically, honing in specifically on civilians, treating hostages, as we've seen, as if they are in a concentration camp. We've seen so many of the hostages come out, and all are reporting routine abuse. Some are reporting sexual abuse. All are reporting malnourishment. All are presenting as having extreme deficiencies, especially in relation to vitamin D and other ways. Many look half-starved. The mental trauma that they have endured, the psychological and emotional abuse that they are continuing to face, even those who remain, all of that has been orchestrated by Hamas. But no, bad Israel for turning off the energy and the water for a day or two.
Yeah, but this goes deeper than this, doesn't it? Because this is effectively the weaponization of international law against Israel. And without taking into account that Israel wouldn't have gone into Gaza if it wasn't for October the 7th. If it wasn't for the biggest mass terrorist attack in Israel's history and the largest number of Jewish people massacred since the Second World War over 80 years.
Weaponization of an international law that Israel is not subject to. The International Criminal Court, Israel has not signed up to, nor has the United States for that matter. So we have this reality that this is a court that thinks it has jurisdiction, but it does not have jurisdiction. It recognizes Palestinian input, has an undue level of recognition of Palestinian input in its system, despite Palestine not actually being a state. This is where we're at.
What's the irony, isn't it, that Israel faces? And the other aspect of this one is that the International Criminal Court in The Hague wants to place the same kind of moral parity as the IDF and Israel with that of Hamas, which is a designated jihadi, genocidal terrorist organization. So Israel had every right to actually go in and send ground troops into Gaza to protect Israel, which faced an existential threat back on October the 7th, 2023.
One of the phrases that we were seeing on October the 7th initially, when reports began to trickle out, was proportionate response. For years, Israel has faced this idea of proportionate response. And this idea is generally completely without proportion and almost always favors the side of Hamas. It almost always favors the side of terror. Then, as the day went along, those who have an understanding of righteousness and justice and what that entails, who understand what Israel is up against, began to speak of appropriate response, which I think is there's an important distinction there. Proportionate response is saying, okay, hold back, lads, just ease down, don't go full on, just make sure that you teach a lesson, but there's no need for all-out war. What we saw was an equivalent of multiple 9/11s in population proportion in Israel. This is a history-defining moment for Israel, for the Jewish people, for the world as a whole. And at this juncture in time, Israel was left with no appropriate solution, no right response beyond sending in ground troops, beyond that appropriate response, which has led to the complete dilapidation of Hezbollah in the north and Lebanon, the destruction of Hamas's founding leadership. There's Mohammed Diaf, Yahya Sinwar, others even in the political bureau as well, and the shaming of the Iranian regime across the Middle East.
No, it's very well put there, Reagan. And also I think the other aspect to this one that we need to talk about as well, when you're talking about proportionality, it's easy for Western journalists to use that term, to use international law, but by looking at the kind of led to parity between the so-called deaths of the Palestinians, which we can't trust anyway because it's all been written up by the Hamas Ministry of Health. And we know they love to exaggerate figures. They like to put the number of their own terrorists that died in this conflict in with innocent Gazans in order to exaggerate the figures. And so yet Israel has been condemned by international public opinion, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, for carrying out actions of self-defense to protect itself from that existential threat posed by Hamas back on October the 7th. Now, it's also important to bring in scripture on this one. So we got Psalm 37, verses 27 to 29, that says, "Depart from evil and do good, and dwell forevermore. For the Lord loves justice and does not forsake his saints. They are preserved forever, but the descendants of the wicked shall be cut off. The righteous shall inherit the land and dwell in it forever." And I think there's also this difference, isn't there, between man's idea of law, man's concept of justice, and that of God's. And of course, any law that is not built on the foundation of the Bible and the Word of God, and recognising God's sovereignty over the affairs of men, which is essentially a humanistic court done in man's eyes. And of course, the International Criminal Court in The Hague is one of those globalist institutions that does not recognise the Word of God as it should, in terms of giving it a legal and moral authority, which is the foundation of Western civilization.
Well, we know where this ends, don't we, Simon? We know that because of its failure to recognize the validity of God's Word and the power behind it, because of the consistent pushing back against the authority of its truth and its enduring promises, it will come to nothing. The ICC will end. The ICC will be destroyed, and those who are a part of it will find their endeavor here a complete waste of time, a complete waste of money. Israel will continue, and it will continue and thrive. This is the nonsense of the ICC's investigation, and not just the investigation, the arrest warrants that are out, is a failure to recognize the gravity of what happened on October the 7th and the necessity of the response. I would go for those who would say, well, this is disproportionate, this is completely outside. Well, proportion, when we talk about it, when we look at the claims being made and the verbiage being used against Netanyahu and against the IDF particularly, what sort of proportion? Because I don't see the IDF going into Gaza and intentionally raping and sexually assaulting Gazan women. I don't see children being as young as 1, 2, and 3 being killed in some cases, or abducted and taken back across the Israeli border. I don't see individuals being kept as domestic slaves in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv who have been kidnapped from Gaza by Israeli civilians who've joined the IDF. I don't see that. If that's the proportion the ICC wants, surely it's not, then the issue here has to be narrowed in terms of what the focus is. This is war, this is conflict. What has happened in response has occurred because of the actions taken by Hamas and Gazan civilians on October the 7th that must in no way go unresponded to.
Another aspect to this one as well is the fact that we're seeing this is being used as a weapon to effectively stop Israel's military objectives in Gaza. Essentially, this is why this international arrest warrant was issued.
But it's not stopping it.
Because it's a way of disarming Israel, using the tools of international law to actually stop Israel from destroying Hamas.
How's it working?
Well, it's not working very well, thankfully, because the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hasn't bowed to the pressure of the Biden administration or the British government or any other government, and has done what's necessary in order to destroy Hamas as a political entity and a terrorist entity. But the problem is that while you've still got the hostages there, it's very, very difficult to launch a military operation with 3 objectives in mind. 1, the destruction of Hamas. 2, the destruction of its terrorist infrastructure and the terror tunnels, and 3, bring the Israeli hostages home. When the Israeli hostages all come home, then Israel's got a better chance of eliminating Hamas. But Donald Trump, for example, on Thursday last week, issued an extraordinary, a brave and courageous executive directive, which is reported by the Times of Israel under this heading, which is ICC prosecutors the first court official to be targeted after Trump restores sanctions. So the International Criminal Court prosecutor, Karim Khan, is the first person to be hit with economic and travel sanctions authorized by US President Donald Trump that target the War Crimes Tribunal over the investigations of US citizens or US allies. 2 sources briefed on the matter told Reuters on Friday. Khan, who is British, was named on Friday in an annex, not yet to be made public, to an executive order signed by Trump earlier that day. A senior ICC official and other sources, both briefed by the US government officials, told Reuters they spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss a confidential matter. So the sanctions include the freezing of US assets of those designated and burying them and their families from visiting the US. So clearly we're seeing that Trump is taking real strong action against the International Criminal Court and the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan.
Well, and the wording of his statement is quite strong and it's quite appropriate. He speaks by the authority vested in me as president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America. He cites the legal powers, including the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, 50 U.S.C. 1701 at SEC, IEEPA, the National Emergencies Act, also Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, and Section 301 of Title III of the United States Code. Do you want to share with us what he said in the statement?
I, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America, find that the International Criminal Court, the ICC, as established by the Rome Statute, has engaged in illegitimate and baseless actions targeting America and our close ally Israel. The ICC has, without a legitimate basis, asserted jurisdiction over and opened preliminary investigations concerning the personnel of the United States and certain of its allies, including Israel, and has further abused its power by issuing baseless arrest warrants targeting Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Foreign Minister of Defense, which I meant to say former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant.
And the ICC has no jurisdiction over the United States or Israel, as neither country is party to the Rome Statute or a member of the ICC. Neither country has ever recognized the ICC's jurisdiction, and both nations are thriving democracies with militaries that strictly adhere to the laws of war. The ICC's recent actions against Israel and the United States set a dangerous precedent, directly endangering current and former United States personnel, including active service members of the armed forces, by exposing them to harassment, abuse, and possible unrest. This malign conduct in turn threatens to infringe upon the sovereignty of the United States and undermines the critical national security and foreign policy work of the United States government and our allies, including Israel.
And the executive order goes on to say, furthermore, in 2002, Congress enacted the American Service Members Act of 2002 to protect the United States military personnel, the United States officials and military personnel of certain allied countries against criminal prosecution by an international criminal court to which the United States is not party, stating, in addition to exposing members of the armed forces of the United States to the risk of international criminal prosecution, the Rome Statute creates a risk that the President and other senior elected and appointed officials of the United States government may be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court.
The United States unequivocally opposes and expects our allies to oppose any ICC actions against the United States, Israel, or any other ally of the United States that has not consented to ICC jurisdiction. The United States remains committed to accountability and to the peaceful cultivation of international order. But the ICC and parties to the Rome Statute must respect the decisions of the United States and other countries not to subject their personnel to the ICC's jurisdiction, consistent with their respective sovereign prerogatives.
Goes on to say that the United States will impose tangible and significant consequences on those responsible for the ICC's transgressions, some of which may include the blocking of property and assets, as well as the suspension of entry into the United States of ICC officials, employees and agents, as well as their immediate family members, as their entry into our nation would be detrimental to the interests of the United States.
I therefore determine that any effort by the ICC to investigate, arrest, detain, or prosecute protected persons, as defined in Section 8D of this order, constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States, and I hereby declare a national emergency to address that threat. Really strong and stirring words by
very impressive.
National emergency.
Very impressive by President Donald Trump. So let's have a look and see how CBN reported this incredible executive order to bring sanctions on the International Criminal Court in The Hague and its chief prosecutor, Corinne Khan.
President Trump's order imposes sanctions on the International Criminal Court over what the White House calls illegitimate and baseless actions targeting America and our close ally Israel, including issuing arrest warrants for the arrest of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant over their conduct of the war in Gaza. Trump accuses the ICC of abusing its power and setting a dangerous precedent by trying to arrest top leaders doing their job. The ICC is calling on its member states to stand up against Trump's sanctions. In Washington, Netanyahu met with more congressional leaders. Axios is reporting while Netanyahu was at the White House, he reportedly laid out his ideas for Phase 2 of the hostage deal in Gaza. They include top Hamas leaders going into exile and Israel ending the war. Netanyahu's spokesman says he didn't present a plan for a second stage of the deal. On Saturday, Hamas is set to free 3 more Israeli men held hostage in Gaza. The Trump administration is also taking more actions against Israel's enemies. One of new Attorney General Pam Bondi's first moves is launching a task force to punish the Hamas terrorists who attacked Israel on October 7th. Ynet News reports the Justice Department says it will seek to extradite the planners and perpetrators of that brutal assault, which killed 1,200 people in Israel, including 47 Americans. The task force will also go after Hamas supporters and funders in the U.S. And the Treasury Department is targeting an oil network which it says generates hundreds of millions of dollars for Iran's military. After meeting with congressional leaders and administration officials, Netanyahu said Thursday they asked him a simple question.
A country that is as small as New Jersey, from where do we get your strength? I said, our strength comes from our people and from our heroic soldiers, and from our faith and the understanding that we are fighting for thousands of years of Jewish history and for our right to a state of our own in the Middle East, in our historic homeland. This is the truth, and it will take us very far.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
The Times of Israel reported on Friday that dozens of countries warned that U.S. sanctions of the ICC could increase the risk of impunity for the most serious crimes and threaten to erode the international rule of law, which is interesting because, again, the U.S. has not even signed up to this, so nor has Israel. The Times of Israel also reported under the headline, countries vow unwavering support for ICC as Trump hits it with sanctions. Dozens of countries expressing their unwavering support for the International Criminal Court on Friday, a day after U.S. President Donald Trump authorized potentially far-reaching economic and travel sanctions against the court's staff. We reaffirm our continued and unwavering support for the independence, impartiality, and integrity of the ICC, a group of almost 80 countries said in a joint statement. Countries that included, of course, France, Germany, and Britain as well. The court serves as a vital pillar of the international justice system by ensuring accountability for the most serious international crimes and justice for victims. But it's interesting, Simon, that those signatories, there were 79 total, they make up only about 2/3 of the International Criminal Court. So one could infer from that some have remained silent, but others, it would seem, including Hungary, definitely seem to be taking more of the side of Donald Trump on this.
No, actually, which is a good thing, and this is what Orban said in a tweet on X. He said it's time for Hungary to review what we're doing in an international organisation that is under US sanctions. New winds are blowing in international politics. We call it the Trump tornado. And then we also see in response to this that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said him and other EU leaders said the following, said sanctions are the wrong tool. They jeopardize an institution that is supposed to ensure that the dictators of the world cannot simply persecute people and start wars. And that is very important. Trump signed the executive order after the US Senate Democrats last week blocked a Republican-led effort to pass legislation setting up sanctions targeting the War Crimes Court. So essentially here we see that so much the international community is signed up to the globalists, including our own Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and a kind of knee-jerk reaction to Trump's executive order kind of puts the actual very standing of the International Criminal Court literally in the dock, which is quite incredible. But I think one thing we need to kind of look at this one and the saying is, what is the values upon which the International Criminal Court is based upon? And the fact is that the International Criminal Court is actually discrediting itself because it was established with the Holocaust in mind, with this whole notion of never and never again. But of course, what happened on October the 7th was never again actually happened. And instead of actually pursuing genocidal leaders for committing acts of genocide, such as Hamas leaders, those of Hezbollah, those of the Iranian regime, those in Sudan. Of course, the easy target is to go with Israel because we're seeing that as being used as a political weapon to target the Israeli Prime Minister and former Defense Minister.
Well, it's very important to look at that reality in the background, the historical context of the ICC, and all the more interesting and important to recognize Israel's complete absence from signing up to it, because it does not deem it a trustworthy organization, nor should it, as it can be seen in this witch hunt by Karim Khan. Starmer, our Prime Minister in the UK's response, quite predictable in many ways. He's backed the ICC after Trump sanctions. According to the Daily Telegraph, Britain has distanced itself from US policy to penalize those who assist in international courts investigations, with Sir Keir Starmer backing the ICC despite sanctions ordered by Donald Trump. On Thursday, the U.S. President issued an executive order placing financial and visa sanctions on individuals and their families who have assisted in ICC investigations of U.S. citizens or the country's allies, such as Israel. So this it goes beyond Israel. Israel just happens to be the primary focus point.
Because they feel Trump feels this is an attack on the United States, this is an attack on any US troops or generals or politicians that have effectively declared a war on terror, taking out the Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, or removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, or confronting ISIS, that American troops, American generals and American politicians could be then taken to The Hague to face alleged war crimes.
And Starmer is short-sighted in this as well. That being the case, this is the concern that the U.S. government has in regard to the ICC and its claims. Starmer should be similarly concerned, but there's this short-sightedness when it comes to Israel and when it comes to this sort of area of foreign policy. Asked whether the Prime Minister was opposed to Mr. Trump's view, a number 10 spokesman said on Friday, ultimately, that's a matter for the U.S. As for the U.K., we support the independence of the ICC.
Well, it's not independent, is it?
Well, it's not, nor is it impartial, but that's what it's meant to be. Yep. So, therefore, we've got no plans to sanction individual court officials, the spokesman said. He later added that the U.K. and U.S. over a number of administrations have taken a different view on the ICC.
So again, we see that our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has no moral courage, and he's also risking that very special relationship with the United States and getting on the wrong side of Donald Trump, which is never a clever move. So let's remind ourselves of when Karim Khan, the QC and the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague, issued an international arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu back in November.
Prime Minister Netanyahu swiftly defended Israel's actions in Gaza.
No war is more just than the war that Israel has been waging in Gaza after Hamas attacked us unprovoked.
Israeli President Isaac Herzog wrote the decision has turned universal justice into a universal laughingstock. The ICC charges Netanyahu and Gallant are guilty of the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare and the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts.
We are accused of deliberately harming civilians, while we are doing everything to prevent harm to civilians. We are accused of starving a population, while we are bringing hundreds of thousands of tons of food to feed the population.
The ICC's charges came amid evidence of another international organization's bias against Israel. A new report from the group UN Watch said a former United Nations Relief and Works Agency Commissioner General held a secret meeting in 2017 with terrorist groups including Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. There, the UNRWA chief reportedly told them, "We are one, and no one can separate us." As for the ICC warrants, they mean Netanyahu or Gallant could be arrested if they go to certain countries accepting the court's authority. Nations such as Ireland and the Netherlands agreed right away to do it if given the chance.
And to those countries, Netanyahu won't be able to travel, and that's a very, very big thing.
Netanyahu's hoping for a tough backlash against the court.
This decision will have severe consequences for the ICC and those who cooperate with its decision.
President-elect Trump's soon-to-be National Security Advisor, Congressman Mike Waltz, promises you can expect a strong response to the anti-Semitic bias of the ICC and UN come January. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul and Republican Senator Lindsey Graham want Senate Leader Chuck Schumer to bring up a bill for a vote that the House has already passed. The measure, called the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act, Senate Bill 224, would impose sanctions on ICC employees or associates who aid this effort to prosecute Israeli leaders. Graham tweeted, "The court is a dangerous joke. It's now time for the Senate to act and sanction this irresponsible body." Paul Strand, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And joining us on this week's Behind the Headlines is Andrew Tucker, who is the director of the Hague Initiative in The Hague. Andrew, it's an absolute pleasure that you can join us from the Netherlands today.
Thank you, Simon. Good to be with you.
Good to be with you as well. Andrew, just share your thoughts on this remarkable executive order that Donald Trump produced last week, effectively putting sanctions on the International Criminal Court in The Hague for its treatment of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant.
Okay, so Simon, this has been brewing and going on for actually over 10 years. What we are seeing is an international legal order which is growingly divisive. The International Criminal Court was established just over 20 years ago, and a number of states decided not to participate in this initiative. It was intended to be established as a global system to go after and capture the greatest war criminals in the world. The United States, Russia, China, and Israel and many other states decided they weren't going to be part of it because they saw the weaknesses in the system. And this is exactly what we're seeing today. We've seen this court go after Israel ever since 2014. You'll remember with the abduction of Israeli soldiers into the Gaza Strip. From that moment, Hamas and other Palestinian organizations were lobbying the court to go after Israel and to prosecute Israeli leaders for war crimes. And the big question has been all along, does the court have the jurisdiction? Does it have the power? Does it have any entitlement or authority whatsoever to do this? And the answer is no, it does not. Because this court is only a court that is of a secondary order. It can only operate in relation to the territory of states that are parties to this ICC system. And Israel is not a party to this system, and Palestine is not a state. So it can't be a state party to the ICC Rome Statute.
Andrew, thank you for your perspective there. Following Donald Trump's comments in regard to the ICC, there has been a statement made and signed by 80 different countries who are a part of the ICC saying, we reaffirm our continued and unwavering support for the independence, impartiality, and integrity of the ICC. But that leaves a significant number of states, about 79, who have not signed up to that particular statement. Is this an indicator of support for Trump's statement by those who have not signed on? Will there be further fallout in the relationship between the United States and those nations that did sign up to this reaffirmation of the ICC?
Well, again, you see the world kind of divided into two. There are 123 states, I think, which are part of the ICC Rome Statute. That leaves about 80 states, just less, that are not even part of the system. And you can see of the 123 states that are a part of it, they're struggling. Some of them are struggling with this idea that the court has issued arrest warrants against the Israeli leaders. There are two issues really, I think, at stake here. One is the court simply doesn't have any jurisdiction over this conflict and therefore over Israeli leaders in relation to the Gaza Strip, which is what these arrest warrants are about. So there's a deep dissatisfaction about the way the court itself is dealing with its own jurisdiction. It's going beyond its mandate. It's a creeping kind of jurisdiction that increasingly countries are not comfortable with. The second thing is just choosing. The court has a wide discretion, the prosecutor, and to choose to go after Israeli leaders in this context where Israel is fighting a very complex urban war of self-defense is also a highly questioning the integrity and the capacity of the prosecutor to operate independently. I think if you look at the states that are supporting the arrest warrants, they're normally the normal states that are very anti-Israel. So they're very happy to see the court go after Israeli leaders. But a number of European states, for example, who are parties to the ICC are saying, well, no, we're not actually going to simply implement these arrest warrants. There are many, many legal issues involved, and they're not willing to simply do what the court says they're doing. There's an additional issue here about the sanctions that Trump is imposing. This is another step. I personally am a little uncomfortable about sanctions. They're a very heavy kind of weapon to be using. I understand the US problems with the court. The US is not part of the court, so it doesn't want to see the court going after Western leaders that are not party to the court system. I understand that. But I think there's a lot of diplomacy that needs to be done to persuade other states that actually the US concerns are important concerns and they should be shared by other Western states as well. So I think the problem is deeper. And I think actually the problem is with those states that are parties to the court, they have failed to live up to their responsibility. They should have stepped in 10 years ago and said the court, Palestine is not a state, so it can't be signing up to these kinds of treaties. First of all, they have to get rid of Hamas and everything else. And then they can become potentially down the road a state in the longer term. But they're not there yet. There's a long way to go. And in the meantime, they shouldn't be going around signing up to international treaties, which they're not entitled to do.
Just got two questions for you in one. The first one is, how much is this a personal agenda of the chief prosecutor, QC Harim Khan, against Israel? And secondly, there's an interesting act of Congress that dates back to 2002 called the American Service Members Protection Act, which has got a nickname called the Hague Invasion Act, which states, should a US service personnel, politician, or any other protected person be seized under the court's direction, then the president would have the authority to invade the Netherlands to free them. Shouldn't this actually worry the government of the Netherlands?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's a personal vendetta of Karim Khan. There are issues, I think, around his perhaps bias, given his own background, but I think the problem is deeper. It went back to the previous prosecutor as well. The court is deeply corrupted. It's deeply influenced by certain states. It's subject to pressure, and I think they've given in to the pressure of the Arab and Islamic world. Secondly, I don't think the Netherlands is going to be too worried about this American act. The Netherlands is in a bit of a dilemma because it's host to the court, so it feels that it has to do everything possible to support the court. And I think the Netherlands has taken a very weak position on this. They came out very quickly saying they're going to enforce these arrest warrants. There was no need for that. They should have taken a much more critical approach, much more objective. But look, again, we're seeing, I think it's a conflict between those states that protect state sovereignty and against the overreach of global institutions like the ICC. And I think those states should stand very firmly, including the Netherlands.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for tuning in and for joining us for this time. We really appreciate your perspective.
Super. Thank you.
And of course, at the weekend, we saw Hamas release another 3 Israeli hostages who looked absolutely horrific. And Donald Trump actually described them as looking like Holocaust survivors. So according to the Jewish News Syndicate, known as the JNS under this title, Trump says the freed Israeli hostages look like Holocaust survivors. The US President Donald Trump expressed on Sunday at the condition of the Israeli hostages released from Hamas captivity a day earlier.
And they looked like Holocaust survivors. They were in horrible condition. They were emaciated. It looked like many years ago, the Holocaust survivors. And I don't know how much longer we could take that when I watch that. I know we have a deal where we're supposed to they dribble in and keep dribbling in, but they are in really bad shape. They have been treated brutally, horribly. Even the ones that came out earlier, they were in a little bit better shape, but mentally they were treated so badly. Who could take that? At some point, we're going to lose our patience. When I see that scene that I saw today with people coming out of helicopters and airplanes that are emaciated, that look like they haven't had a meal in a month.
The treatment of the Israeli hostages by Hamas goes against the Geneva Convention and is a war crime and a clear crime against humanity. Trump is exactly right in his statement there.
No, absolutely. But isn't there a danger here? We're seeing that the International Criminal Court in The Hague is wanting to make a moral equivalency between the IDF and that of Hamas. When Hamas commit the most vile and awful crimes, they couldn't even look after the hostages well, in the sense that they were malnourished, they were starved, they were tortured. There was even one case of one of the hostages, reports of being hung upside down in one of the tunnels for hours on end. So the torture that these people went through is just beyond comprehension, and yet the international community is silent. But instead, our Prime Minister, European governments, the German government, the French government are supporting the ICC against Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, it's like the world has lost all sense of sanity and has lost its moral compass. Thankfully, we have a president back in the White House who hasn't lost his moral clarity whatsoever.
In regard to this issue, I would agree with that. And some are saying that these hostages are being treated or have been treated like animals. I think they've been treated worse than animals. And if someone routinely locks up their dog in a cage and routinely beats and prods it and tortures it, okay, perhaps that is what has been experienced here. That's what was experienced by Yarden Bibas, who was locked in a cage and beaten every day for the first week of his tenure as a hostage. Others did not see daylight a single time during their ordeal. Others, have reported being tortured in a range of ways. And you can see that particularly in the returning male hostages. The female hostages have reported sexual abuse and assault in various ways. One of the earlier released hostages in the first batch reported rape, at least one, but has been willing for her name to be published and for the story to be shared. So this is the ordeal that has been experienced and gone through by so many. That in the last batch, reports of being fed very, very rarely, every few days, some rotten, moldy pita bread being given that they had to share among themselves. Hence the very clear, they're unrecognizable, right?
Exactly.
You put the pictures of who they are now versus who they were prior to their being taken hostage, totally unrecognizable.
And we see that Stefan Daisley has written an excellent article for The Spectator under this title, Trump's ICC Sanctions Will Test an Outdated Institution. So he writes, the ICC was continuing policy by other means when it issued the arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The two stand accused of crimes against humanity and war crimes over Operation Swords of Iron. Jerusalem's response to the Palestinian invasion of its territory and the mass murder of its citizens back on October the 7th, 2023. Israel protested the court's actions, which were prompted by Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, as one-sided interference in the military actions of a sovereign democracy, which is not a member of the tribunal and does not recognise its jurisdiction. The court is relying on its jurisdiction over Palestine, which is not a sovereign state and lacks defined international borders. Now, he does bring an absolute gem in this one. He says in the 2002 Congress Act called the American Service Members Protection Act, the informal title is actually the Hague Invasion Act. Should a US service personnel, politician or any other protected person be seized under the court's direction, the president would have the authority to invade the Netherlands to free them, which is extraordinary, which I didn't actually know actually existed. So here we are, we're having President Trump saying, if you arrest any of my administration, any US generals, or even allies of the United States, namely Israel, Japan, or Great Britain, and they're arrested in the International Hague, then America has the right to invade the Netherlands and actually to rescue them. Now, those are threats that we heard that Trump has made over Greenland. Could he make those threats over the government of Netherlands? He could well do. It just shows you the anger that the Americans hold the International Criminal Court and for the way they're treating the Israeli Prime Minister, who's an incredible statesman.
Trump recognizes the U.S. is not in the same position as a country which is not party to the Roman Statute. It's not a member of the court, has never recognized its jurisdiction. And so the description of the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant is setting a dangerous precedent that threatens to infringe upon the sovereignty of the United States holds very, very clear. There's an editorial in The Sun newspaper on the ICC with The Sun saying Donald Trump's war on the International Criminal Court is a reckoning long overdue. So even in our press, we're seeing some split opinion over this, but there does seem to be a significant amount of appreciation for the boldness of Trump's sanctions as well, with this hope that the ICC will examine its own radical politicization.
So let's have a look now at the Israeli Prime Minister, and this is courtesy of the Israeli government press office and the Prime Minister's office, Benjamin Netanyahu, talking about how outrageous the decision was by the ICC to bring an international arrest warrant for his arrest.
The anti-Semitic decision of the International Court in The Hague is a modern Dreyfus trial, and it will end the same way. 130 years ago, the French Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus was falsely accused of treason by a biased French court. In response to these false accusations, the great French writer Émile Zola wrote his monumental essay, J'accuse. He accused the French court of anti-Semitic lies against an innocent officer who was later exonerated of all guilt. Now an international court in The Hague, also headed by a French judge, is repeating this outrageous offense. It is falsely accusing me, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and Israel's former Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, of deliberately targeting civilians. This when we do everything in our power to avoid civilian casualties. We issue millions of text messages, phone calls, leaflets to the citizens of Gaza to get them out of harm's way, while the Hamas terrorists do everything in their power to keep them in harm's way, including shooting them, using them as human shields. The court in The Hague accuses us of a deliberate policy of starvation. This when we've supplied Gaza with 700,000 tons of food to feed the people of Gaza. That's 3,200 calories for every man, woman, and child in Gaza. And these supplies are routinely looted by Hamas terrorists who deprive their people of much-needed food. Yet just in the last few weeks, Israel facilitated the vaccination of 97% of the people of Gaza against polio. This doesn't prevent the court of accusing us of genocide. What in God's name are they talking about in The Hague? The truth is simple. No war is more just than the war that Israel has been waging in Gaza after Hamas attacked us unprovoked, launching the worst massacre against the Jewish people since the Holocaust. The decision to issue an arrest warrant against me, the democratically elected Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and our former Defense Minister, was made by a rogue prosecutor who's trying to extricate himself from sexual harassment charges, and by biased judges who are motivated by anti-Semitic sentiments against the one and only Jewish state. These judges did nothing. They did nothing against the real war crimes committed against the millions who've been murdered or uprooted by the dictatorships in Iran, Syria, and Yemen. Instead, they falsely accused the one democracy in the Middle East, Israel, thereby imperiling the right of all democracies to defend themselves against murderous terrorists and tyrants. Nor did the court do anything against the Hamas terrorists who raped our women, beheaded our men, burned babies alive in front of their parents, and kidnapped hundreds of men, women, and children to the underground dungeons of Gaza. They're still holding 101 hostages, citizens of many lands, including the United States. Come to think of it, the court did issue one arrest warrant against Hamas. Now hear this. They issued an arrest warrant against the corpse of the Hamas arch-terrorist Mohammed Dev. His corpse. What an absurdity. No biased anti-Israel decision in The Hague will prevent the State of Israel from defending its citizens. And I want to thank our many friends around the world, especially those in the United States, who've condemned this outrage and who have said that this decision will have severe consequences for the ICC and those who cooperate with its decision. Israel will not recognize the validity of this decision. We will continue to do everything we must do to defend our citizens and defend our state against Iran's axis of terror, Iran and its terrorist proxies, which include Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others. Our enemies are your enemies, and our victory will be your victory, the victory of civilization over barbarism and tyranny.
Now, that Sun editorial that we referred to a few minutes ago said it may horrify polite North London dinner parties.
Do you often attend many of those?
Not my dinner parties, but and Donald Trump's role in the International Criminal Court is a reckoning long overdue. Its credibility was already shot before it blew up with its fact-mangling assault on Israel and arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu over war crimes, including the alleged starvation of Gaza's people, despite it being obvious that aid is routinely stolen by Hamas, and it also being obvious that there is no starvation or famine for that matter. The ICC failure to recognize Israel as a democratic nation justifiably defending itself against racial terrorists still holding Jewish hostages betrayed a repugnant bias, obliterating any legitimacy it had. Even Joe Biden called the ICC way of putting things outrageous. I don't think we're going
absolutely. So it's a good editorial by the Sun, again showing moral clarity, and of course Donald Trump needs to be congratulated. I'll tell you what, it's great to have him back in the White House. He's not acting like I thought he was, but I'm pleased he's back to the old Trump, or maybe a better Trump than he was in his first administration, defending Israel and actually showing moral courage in the world and really shaking it up. So we got him to thank for really shaking up the ICC. One of the implications of this, actually, with the sanctions on the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, is the fact he regularly goes to New York. He regularly has meetings with the UN. So it'd be interesting to see now if he's actually barred from attending those UN meetings, because he will have to fly into New York airspace in order to get to the UN.
Well, what's certainly clear is that there is no barrier from Netanyahu or Yoav Gallant from entering New York or any other place in the United States for that matter, with Netanyahu just spending a week in the United States working on that building of alliance. But the ICC has weaponized international law to support Israel's military ability to defeat an Islamist genocidal terror organization that murdered more Jewish people in one single day than we have seen for the past 80 years. In the Nazi Holocaust. Keir Starmer is shameful for not backing Trump, but instead wants to work with our enemies to bring down Israel in the West and support vile globalist institutions like the ICC. And yet we see God using President Trump in a way that sees the judgment brought on the ICC. God bless you all.